Just recently, the big news was a serious and quote, destabilizing foreign military capability, which drove everyone crazy guessing what it could be. Now it's been confirmed that the foreign nation is Russia, and that capability is an anti-satellite weapon, and also that it's still in development and not yet active or deployed yet. But Russia, and by extension the Soviet Union, has had anti-satellite weapons since pretty much the beginning of the space race. Even before Yuri Gagarin was launched into space, the Soviet Union was working on a program called the Satellite Fighter, or Istrebitel Sputnikov. It was simple, but it did the job. In fact, destroying satellites in space really isn't all that difficult. If you could dock two spaceships together in space, like the US, Russia, Japan, and the European Union have with the International Space Station, for example, then you pretty much can easily make an anti-satellite weapon. All you have to do is go a little faster than safe docking speed. So this new Russian anti-satellite weapon must be much more capable if they're considering it, quote, destabilizing. So instead of just speculating on what it might be, I thought it'd be more interesting to look at what capabilities overall Russia currently has in space. After all, likely one of the biggest assets that the US can provide Ukraine with is its massive capabilities of its huge space-based spy and reconnaissance satellites in orbit. Everything from the imaging satellites we all know of, to giant football field-sized parabolic antennas that can monitor everything from radar emissions to cell phone signals. So, what capabilities does Russia have? But first, real quick, our sponsor this week making the video possible, Factor 75. It's from the same company that brings you HelloFresh, which is another great company that I use and pay for myself, and actually have 3 meals of theirs in my refrigerator right now that I'm looking forward to. And Factor 75 takes it a step further in convenience. No cooking, no dishes, no preparation. Just a few minutes in the microwave, or a few more in the oven, gives you a full delicious meal. Which is awesome, as there's so many times that come up where I just don't feel like cooking. And that's the most tempting time to then order food, which as you know ends up costing a ton. Plus, their meals can help you reach your goal, with nutritious meals, ingredients with integrity, and are dietitian approved. And that's the great part about it. It's extremely flexible, with dozens of meal choices, including vegan, keto, calorie smart, and more. So go over there and check them out, get 50% off your first Factor box, and free wellness shots for life using my link. That means you could choose 2 free wellness shots from 3 available flavors for every order while you're an active subscriber. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Again, that's Factor 75. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's space industry, and therefore military capabilities, were really in a rough shape to say the least. In fact, Russia still used film in their spy satellites up till 2015 with the final Yantar launch. This meant waiting till the end of the satellite's mission, which lasted 45 days, before the film canister was ejected and returned to Earth before they could even see the images. But today, they've been growing and modernizing their space capabilities. Currently, with somewhere around 110 satellites in orbit. Now, it's hard to give an exact number, as it depends on how you count them. For example, some are used both for military and civilian purposes, and also there's been many secret ones discovered. Also, a lot of satellites likely have more than one function. A communications satellite in geostationary orbit might also have a signals intelligence payload as well, for example, and things like SAR, radar imaging satellites, can have a lower resolution optical camera. First, let's skip through the boring ones. First, GLONASS. It's a satellite navigation system similar to GPS, but they've actually launched almost twice as many as the US has GPS satellites. But today, there are 24 operational. These I don't think need much explaining. We're all familiar with things like GPS. But having their own satellite system means they don't have to rely on any other country's systems that could be disabled, and they're incredibly useful for guiding military aircraft and weapons to targets. Other boring ones we can gloss over are military communications satellites. They have 20 to 40 currently, depending on how you count them. For example, the Ganets-M are technically civilian versions of the Rodnik, and other older satellites likely aren't operational anymore. On the same note are 12 early warning satellites to detect nuclear launches, and at least 2 geodesies which take detailed measurements of the Earth and its gravity to assist in targeting of long-range ballistic missiles. Then, more of the interesting stuff, imaging satellites. They likely have about 11 total, but nearly half of them are pretty small and likely can't provide the very high-resolution imagery or capability. The more interesting ones are the 5 BARS-M, 2 of which are already well past their intended lifespan, so there's possibly only 3 left, and the 2 Persona satellites. These ones are much larger, with masses 15 to 30 times those smaller EO, MKA, RASBIG, and RASDAN satellites. But all 11 have an orbital period of around 90 to 100 minutes, meaning 15 to 16 orbits per day. The circumference of the Earth is 40,000 kilometers. Half of that would be in the daylight, when satellites could photograph. if its swath or the width was 30 kilometers, which is around what other satellites of similar resolution have. In theory, that means they could get imagery of any one spot roughly every 4 days. That's at the equator though. At 50 degrees north, which is roughly where Ukraine is at, they can get an image of any single location every 2.5 days on average. There's a lot of variables though to this. For one, cloud cover. Kyiv, for example, is cloudy nearly 50% of the year, so on average they'd only get half that much usable imagery, so once every 5 days. But also the larger and more capable Bar-Zem and Persona could rotate in orbit to photograph sites they're not directly flying over, and they can also obtain imagery from the private sector like I do. Planet alone has more active high-resolution satellites than Russia, with 17, and there's many other companies as well. They also have a few SAR imaging satellites as well. 2 Condor, with 2 more planned this year, and the Neutron satellite is likely a SAR as well. Roscosmos recently released a few images from the Condor FKA that was launched last year, and they've stated that it has a 1.8 meter resolution in spotlight mode. And that's pretty good, but it's nowhere near even what private sector companies in the West are capable of. Here, for example, is a 25 centimeter image from Umbra Labs. That's over 7 times more pixels in width and in length, so over 50 times higher quality, or number of pixels. And there's also several other companies offering sub-meter SAR imagery as well, like Capella and ICEYE. And then SIGINT, or Signals Intelligence. These ones are really hard to count. Some satellites that are reportedly non-military, like Luch, which are said to be relay satellites for television, GLONASS, and the International Space Station, have been accused to be gathering intelligence with the SIGINT payload. But beyond that, there's likely one remaining Selena 2, 7 Lotus, or Liana, 1 Pion NKS, and 2 Olympic K. And then finally, there's several others, either minor ones not worth mentioning, or whose role isn't known, or even secret ones they don't mention at all. This is something Russia has done quite a bit. To observers, sometimes an object just appears to be a piece of debris from a launch. However, sometimes days, weeks, or even months later, they begin to maneuver, indicating that they're actually active satellites. Many of these are referred to as inspector satellites officially. Some are believed to be anti-satellite weapons. Like I mentioned in the very beginning of the video, these would be very simple and very slow ASAT weapons, similar to those early Soviet ones. They would launch, slowly align their orbit with their target, catch up to it, and remain nearby until it's needed to ram into it. Again, they're simple and effective, but slow. It could take days to catch up with its target, and if their enemy launched a new satellite, they'd likely need to launch a whole new one, which could take months before they're ready, then several more days for it to catch up. So these type have less capability than the modern direct descent weapons like the US SM-3 in 2006, or China's test, or India, or even Russia's other anti-satellite test using the A-235. But overall, there's been over a dozen of these that I classify under other. And this is, I guess, where we could talk about the anti-satellite weapon in development that's been in the news recently. Anonymous sources said it was a nuclear anti-satellite weapon, but there's some confusion on whether it means it has a nuclear payload or it's nuclear powered. Having a nuclear payload doesn't really make a lot of sense. Detonating it would likely not only destroy its target, but also virtually every satellite in orbit as well. Masal Dalrin has written some pretty good stuff here on Twitter on the topic that you should check out. But beyond the blast itself, the Earth's magnetic field would trap a lot of the radiation, and it could end up disabling all low Earth orbit satellites. And that would be a pretty desperate measure. Using such a weapon would mean that their satellites would be destroyed, as well as allies like China, which I'd imagine would make them pretty upset with Russia. So nuclear powered is more likely. Nuclear power can offer you so much more power than solar panels alone, and that power could be used for propulsion to change orbits, or to power powerful directed energy and electronic warfare weapons. And the real crazy thing is with some of these types of weapons, if you used it, it's possible your enemy might not even know they were attacked. This means they could even be used potentially in peacetime, with good plausible deniability. The target, the US for example, might just lose contact with one of their satellites and not know whether it was attacked or it simply just failed, which satellites do at times. So I think that pretty accurately fits with the term, quote, destabilizing capability that the US officials were using. Also, compared to other ASATs, using directed energy or electronic warfare would be nearly instantaneous, as it would be traveling at the speed of light. And conventional ASATs are limited by how much fuel they can carry. Satellites in a higher inclination, or even just in higher altitude orbits, might be out of reach for them. Whereas with this potential directed energy ASAT, as long as it could see the target and has enough power, it could hit any satellite. Which I guess makes you then wonder if the US could even do anything to defend against such a weapon. Despite destroying 2 satellites in orbit with 2 different weapons, the US does not currently, at least officially, have any anti-satellite weapons. The ASM-135 used back in the 80s was officially cancelled in 1988. And the SM-3 used in Operation Burnt Frost was not a normal SM-3. It was specifically and heavily modified for the mission. It is possible that the US could modify other SM-3s for anti-satellite roles, and it's possible they stored away some ASM-135s that could be used, which was actually a plot point in Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising. But again, this new Russian weapon reportedly isn't operational and it's still in development. So if the US saw a real threat, they do have some time to design and build countermeasures, such as a new anti-satellite weapon to destroy it, or perhaps even build their own similar system as a deterrent, letting Russia know that if they do use theirs, the US would do the same. But getting back to the heart of the video, on what space capabilities Russia has, it has a lot compared to the rest of the world, but absolutely less than world leaders like the US and China. They have their own navigation system, which is a major plus. They have communication satellites, but likely not in significant enough numbers for high speed and large data transfer real-time information between remote sections of their military. Optical and EO imaging, they actually have more than I originally thought. But based on the physical size of these satellites and known information, we can actually calculate a rough idea of what they're capable of. Things like the size of its primary mirror, which gives us the maximum possible angular resolution, and then from their altitude, the best possible resolution they can achieve. And with all these numbers, it's well below US satellite capabilities that we learnt of from things like President Trump's tweet. Also, the low number of them really limits how much imagery, and therefore information, they can gather. Combine that with the few radar imaging satellites that they have means that they have a pretty limited capability to truly observe and watch Ukrainian troop and vehicle movements in time to take real action. And SIGINT, or Signals Intelligence, which is listening in and collecting signals that are being emitted, whether it's from radars or communications or even tracking cell phones. Again, it's difficult to judge these. Signals Intelligence satellites are often the most classified satellites for any country, but we can look at the number, size, and orbit to get an idea. To compare with the US, satellites like Orion are the largest in space. They launch retracted to fit inside the payload fairing, and then they would open up like an umbrella. The massive size of their antenna actually isn't for picking up longer wavelengths. In fact, in theory, the diameter could even be smaller than the wavelength, but it wouldn't be very efficient. The main reason for having such a massively large diameter parabolic antenna is to achieve higher gain, and this just means it's focused on the direction it's pointing. Radio waves from other directions just reflect back off it and into space. What does matter in terms of wavelength is the feed antenna, and likely, in the case of Orion, since it's in space and it can't be changed out, it would have multiple that could be moved around to capture a wider span of wavelengths. But all this gives these satellites capabilities to identify, track, and listen in on radio signals of all types. And the size helps amplify even the weakest signals, a capability that Russian SIGINT satellites are nowhere near capable of, from what we know. And that's about it. Compared to the US, which is probably the most important comparison due to the ongoing war, and the fact that they would be competing in intelligence gathering with them if the US was sharing it with Ukraine, they don't have anywhere near the capabilities. But compared to the rest of the world, they'd rank pretty high, at least in the top 5. And they've come a massive way in the last 20 years, and also currently have a pretty ambitious launch schedule this year of satellites that will only further increase Russia's capabilities in space.